released it the moment he asked about the deed. Not the first time. I told myself it was just curiosity. But by the fourth time, standing in my own kitchen, watching him run his finger along the edge of my oak countertop like he was already measuring it for something else, I knew. I just didn't know yet how far he was willing to go. My name is Frances Whitmore, and I have lived in the same house in Wolfville, Nova Scotia for 31 years. The house sits on 2.5 acres at the edge of town, backing onto a ridge of sugar maples that my late husband planted the year our daughter was born. He planted one for every year he hoped to live there. There are 40 trees. He only made it to 26. When Thomas died 4 years ago, I was 58 years old, and I did not know how to be a widow. I knew how to be a wife, a mother, a school librarian for 22 years, a woman who made her own bread on Sundays and kept her accounts in a ledger by hand because she never trusted anything she couldn't hold. I knew those things. But grief has a way of reshaping you whether you consent to it or not, and for the first year, I was simply surviving. Paying the hydro bill. Making sure my daughter called me on Wednesdays, eating something warm before bed. My daughter's name is Abby. She was 24 when her father died, working at a landscaping firm in Halifax, living in a basement apartment she painted yellow because she said it felt like morning light. She is the kind of person who brings food to people she barely knows and remembers the names of strangers' dogs. Thomas adored her. I adore her. She has always been the steadiest thing in my life, even when the rest of it was shifting. She met him at a work function. A fundraiser for a local conservation group he'd donated, she'd helped organize. That was the story he told anyway. His name was Ryan, and he was 37, which made him 10 years older than Abby and 25 years younger than me. And I mention that only because later it mattered. The first time Abby brought Ryan to Wolfville, it was a long weekend in September. The maples had just started to turn, and the house looked the way it always does in fall. Warm and a little golden, and like something from the kind of life people imagine when they imagine Canada. I had made a roast. I had set the good plates. I was nervous in the way mothers are nervous, wanting to like him for her sake, wanting him to be worthy of her in the way no one ever quite is when you're the one who raised her. He was charming. I'll give him that. He had a handshake that felt practiced and a smile that landed just slightly too wide. And I noticed both of those things and filed them away because I am a librarian, and librarians notice things that don't quite add up. He helped clear the table without being asked. He asked me about Thomas, how we met, what he was like, how long we'd been together. Those questions felt kind at the time. I answered them honestly. I talked about Thomas's work as a civil engineer, how he'd managed infrastructure contracts across the province for nearly 3 decades. I talked about how careful he'd been, how we'd saved slowly and never spent more than we had. I talked about the house, the property, the trees. Ryan listened with his chin in his hand and his eyes very attentive, and I remember thinking, at least he's engaged, at least he's engaged, at least he's interested. He asked at the end of the evening, while Abby was in the bathroom, where exactly my property ended at the back. I told him the ridge. The stone wall my husband built marks the southern boundary, and the creek on the west side is the natural line. He nodded and asked how many acres again. I told him. He nodded again and said, "That's a significant piece of land, especially this close to the Valley Wine Corridor." I said, "It is." And then Abby came back and we talked about something else. I told myself it was small talk. I told myself he was just making conversation, the way people do when they're in an unfamiliar house and don't know what else to say. I believed that for about 3 more visits. The second time he asked about the property, we were walking the back edge while Abby was inside helping me start dinner. He asked whether I'd ever thought about subdividing. I said no. He asked whether I'd had it appraised recently. I said it wasn't something I'd considered. He said land near the Annapolis Valley was appreciating significantly, that there were buyers who specifically looked for parcels like mine, that if I were ever thinking about liquidity. I stopped walking. I looked at him. "Ryan," I said, This land has been in my family for over 30 years. My husband planted those trees. I'm not interested in selling." He put his hands up and smiled, that same wide smile, and said he was only thinking out loud, that he had some background in real estate investment and it was a habit. He apologized. He seemed genuinely embarrassed. I let it go. I shouldn't have. The third time was worse. He'd started joining Abby on her calls to me, not every call, but enough that I noticed. He would be in the background at first, and then one day, he was the one who called, saying Abby was in the shower but he wanted to ask me something. He asked whether my estate had been updated since Thomas passed, whether I had a current will, whether I'd thought about putting the property into a trust. I was quiet for long enough that he kept talking, filling the silence the way people do when they know they've said something wrong. I told him my affairs were managed, and I appreciated his concern. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The sun was coming through the window at that low November angle, and the light was very thin and pale. And I thought about Abby, how happy she seemed, how she talked about Ryan with a warmth I hadn't heard from her in years, not since she was small and everything was still uncomplicated. I thought about how much I did not want to be wrong about him, but I am a woman who kept a ledger by hand. I am a woman who spent 2 decades watching children find the information they needed, who taught them to follow the thread of a question until it led somewhere true. I do not ignore things that don't add up. I called my solicitor the following week. Her name is Patricia, and she has handled my family's legal matters for 15 years, and she is one of the few people I trust completely. I sat across from her in her office in Kentville, and I told her everything. Every question Ryan had asked, every conversation, the call about the will. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Frances, I want you to think carefully before I say this, because I'm not trying to alarm you. But this pattern, the questions about land value, the inquiry about your estate, the interest in your will, this is consistent with a type of financial exploitation that we see more often than people realize, especially targeting widowed women with significant assets." She used the words elder financial abuse. I was 62 years old, and I had never once thought of myself as someone who needed to be protected. I sat in that chair and felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the November outside. Thomas and I had saved carefully for 30 years. The house was paid off. There was the property, appraised at just over $900,000, and the investment accounts, a little under $1.2 million, split between registered funds and a non-registered portfolio, the kind of careful accumulation that happens when 2 people spend their whole lives putting away what they don't spend. It wasn't extravagant. It was decades of discipline and a little luck. And it was everything I had left of the life Thomas and I had built. Patricia helped me take 3 steps. First, I updated my will to make it absolutely airtight, specifying that no property or asset could be transferred, sold, or held in trust for any individual who had been introduced into the family within the last 5 years without independent legal review and a waiting period of 12 months. Second, I moved all original documents, deed, investment records, trust papers, into a safety deposit box that only I and Patricia could access. Third, I hired a private investigator. His name was Paul, and he was retired RCMP, and he did not waste my time. What Paul found over 6 weeks was this: Ryan had been engaged twice before. The first woman was a widow in her late 50s living in New Brunswick, a schoolteacher with a small house and a modest inheritance. The engagement ended when she discovered he'd tried to access her line of credit using information he'd obtained during what she thought was a joint financial planning session. She didn't press charges. She just wanted him gone. The second woman was in Ontario, younger, and that situation had ended when her family intervened. There was no criminal record because neither woman had gone to the authorities. There was just a pattern, like a watermark you can only see when you hold the paper up to the light. I sat with that information for 3 days. 3 days of making my bread on Sunday and walking the back property and watching the maples bare now in January, standing in their rows the way Thomas had planted them. I thought about Abby, about the yellow apartment, about the way she laughed when she talked about him, how she said he made her feel like the most important person in any room. I did not tell her right away. That was the hardest decision I have ever made, harder even than selling Thomas's truck, harder than clearing his clothes from the wardrobe, because to not tell her was to let her keep believing in something that was already broken. But I also knew that if I told her too soon, before I had everything, he could disappear. He could take what he'd managed to extract, which at that point was still only information, thank God, and he could move on to the next woman and none of it would ever catch him. So I waited. I kept taking the Wednesday calls. I kept being cordial when he was on the line. I told Abby I loved her every time, and I meant it every time, and I kept the rest behind my teeth. In March, Abby called to tell me Ryan had proposed. She was happy in a way that broke my heart to hear. She said yes before he'd finished asking. She said, and she laughed at herself for it, and the laugh was so entirely Abby, self-deprecating and bright and completely without artifice that I had to press my hand against my chest for a moment just to keep myself steady. I told her I was so glad she was happy. I told her Ryan was a lucky man. I asked her when she was thinking. She said October. 7 months away. 7 months. I called Paul that afternoon. I called Patricia the next morning. We had one more piece to find. Paul had been monitoring Ryan's communications as much as legally permitted, and through a contact he had in the financial sector, he obtained, through proper legal channels. With a court order, Patricia helped arrange evidence that Ryan had made inquiries with 2 separate mortgage brokers about the feasibility of refinancing a property in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. He had provided them with approximate details about the land parcel that matched mine. He had done this 3 months before the proposal. He had been planning this before he asked her. Patricia connected me with a detective in the Economic Crimes Unit of the RCMP. We presented everything. The previous engagements, the inquiries to the mortgage brokers, the call to me about the will, the pattern. The detective took it seriously. She told me they needed a little more time to build a proper file, and I said, whatever you need. And I meant that too. The wedding was set for the 14th of October. It was going to be at a small inn outside of Windsor. White clapboard, apple orchard out back. The kind of place Abby had dreamed about since she was young. She asked me to come early and help with the flowers. She asked me to walk her down the aisle, since there was no one else. I said yes. Of course I said yes. And I kept holding everything inside me like water behind a wall, waiting for the right moment. The detective called me on the 6th of October. She told me they had enough. She told me the plan was to move before the ceremony, that she would have officers present that morning, and that Ryan would be arrested before the service began. But she asked me something first. She asked whether Abby knew. I said no. I said I needed to tell her myself. That night I drove to Halifax. I sat down with my daughter at her kitchen table, the yellow apartment, the morning light walls, and I put everything in front of her. The investigator's report, the mortgage inquiries, the 2 women before her, Patricia's legal file. I didn't dress it up. I didn't soften it. She was my daughter, and she deserved the full truth. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Since November." She looked at me. "You carried this since November?" I nodded. She was angry. I understood why. I would have been angry too. She said she felt foolish, and I told her that being deceived by someone skilled at deception does not make you foolish. That is not weakness, I said. That is being a person who trusts people. There is nothing wrong with being a person who trusts people. What is wrong is what he did with that trust. We sat in her kitchen until 2 in the morning. She cried. I held her. We talked about her father, because somehow we always end up there when things get hard. Back to Thomas, back to the steady center of what we've built. She asked what happened next. I told her. On the 14th of October, at 7:30 in the morning, before the guests arrived, before the florist had finished, RCMP officers arrested Ryan outside the inn. He was charged with fraud, attempted financial exploitation, and 2 counts related to the investigations in New Brunswick and Ontario, which had been reopened when his pattern came to light. He did not say anything when they put him in the car. He just looked back toward the building, and I was standing in the doorway, and our eyes met, and I held his gaze until he looked away. Abby stood beside me and she did not look at him at all. The guests arrived to find a different kind of gathering than expected. Abby stood in the apple orchard in her dress. She wore it anyway because she said she'd bought it for herself and she wasn't going to let him take that too. And her friends were there and there was food, and after a while there was even something that felt, strangely and quietly, like a celebration, not of the day that didn't happen, of the one that did, of Abby standing in October light, still whole. I kept the deed in my own name. I kept the maples. I kept the ledger by hand. What I gained, I couldn't have named at the start of all this. I suppose it was the knowledge that the things Thomas and I built together, slowly, carefully, across 30 years were still ours, still standing, and that my daughter, the steadiest thing in my life, was still standing too. She called me the following Wednesday, same as always. She asked about the maples. I told her they'd held their leaves later than usual this year. We talked for an hour. When we said goodbye, she said, "I love you, Mum." I said, "I love you too, my girl." Some things, it turns out, he never had a chance of taking. I keep thinking about that November afternoon when I sat at my kitchen table after hanging up the phone. The light coming in thin and pale through the window, and I thought, this is the moment where I either act or I don't. There was no one to tell me which way to go. There was only what I knew and what I was willing to do with it. Ryan was counting on me to do nothing. Not because he thought I was stupid, because he thought I was alone, a widow in her 60s, still soft with grief, wanting her daughter to be happy, wanting it badly enough, maybe, to look the other way. That's the calculation people like him make. They look for the place where love makes you vulnerable, and they set up camp there. What he didn't account for was that love can also make you very, very clear. I think about the choices that led to what happened, and I can trace every one of them back to their cause. Ryan's pattern didn't start with Abby. It started earlier, 2 other women, 2 other situations where no one put the full picture together in time, where the cost of letting it go quietly felt smaller than the cost of speaking up. That silence had consequences. It allowed him to refine what he was doing, to get better at it, to find the next person. There is a straight line between those earlier moments and the morning he stood outside that inn in Windsor and watched everything come apart. Actions accumulate. They compound. That is simply true, whether we find it comfortable or not. And on my side, there is a line too. I kept a ledger by hand for 30 years because I believe in accounting for things, in seeing clearly what is there, not what you wish were there. That habit, that insistence on following a question until it leads somewhere true, is what let me see Ryan for what he was, before it was too late. It was not luck. It was a way of moving through the world that I had chosen, slowly, over a long time. Abby, standing in the apple orchard in her dress, not looking at him. That image stays with me. She had every reason to fall apart that day, and she didn't. She was angry, and she was hurt. And she was hurt, and she was also, underneath it all, entirely herself. That is not something that happens by accident either. You build that kind of steadiness the same way you build anything that lasts, slowly, with attention, without shortcuts. I am not a woman who believes the world is arranged to reward the good and punish the wicked on any reliable schedule. I have lived long enough to know that isn't how it works. But I do believe that the quality of your choices shapes the life you end up living. That being honest, even when it's inconvenient, keeps your judgment clean. That thinking carefully, really carefully, not just reacting, is one of the most protective things a person can do for themselves and for the people they love. And that when things get hard, the ones who get through it are almost never the ones who had it easy. They're the ones who decided, quietly, not to give up. Frances held. Abby held. And on a Wednesday in November, a week after everything, my daughter called me the same as always, and we talked about the maples, and for an hour the world was exactly the right size. That's what you protect when you protect it. Not the land, not the accounts. The Wednesday call, the yellow apartment, the life that is actually yours